Neighbor calls cops on LGBTQ plus family, then discovers they own the block. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Carl Jenkins leaned back in his creaky lawn chair, the aluminum frame groaning beneath his weight. He adjusted the brim of his sun-bleached baseball cap, squinting down the street with his usual blend of suspicion and disapproval. It was a quiet, ordinary suburban afternoon, the kind Carl had enjoyed for decades. The neat lawns, the sound of distant lawnmowers humming, and the faint smell of barbecues in backyards were the lifeblood of Maplewood Heights. At least it used to be. Today, Carl's peace was disturbed by something he didn't like, something different. A U-Haul truck was parked in the driveway of the two-story yellow house across the street. It wasn't the truck itself that bothered Carl. He'd seen families come and go over the years, but the people unloading it were what set his teeth on edge. A group of 5 stood on the lawn, laughing and carrying boxes back and forth. They were vibrant, joyful, and loud enough for Carl to hear across the road. At the center was a confident woman with short, dark hair and a piercing smile, Matilda Rivera. She looked to be in her 40s, tall and well-built, with a posture that radiated self-assurance. Her wife, Jess, a slender woman with kind eyes and a rainbow bandana tied around her head, was holding a small box labeled Fragile. Beside them, a younger couple, 2 men, joked and exchanged playful nudges as they carried furniture inside. One had bright red hair, tied back in a loose ponytail, while the other wore sunglasses and a shirt that boldly read, "Love is love." Carl scowled. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, his knuckles tightening on the arms of the lawn chair. He glanced up and down the street, hoping to catch the eye of someone who shared his sentiments. The neighborhood felt quieter than usual, as though it too was holding its breath. The occasional car rolled by, its driver slowing to stare at the new arrivals. Carl craned his neck, trying to see more as Matilda laughed, a deep, warm laugh that rang through the air and made Carl's frown deepen. "Unbelievable," he grumbled. "Just unbelievable." Carl had lived in Maplewood Heights for 35 years. He'd raised his kids here, built friendships with the other longtime residents, and prided himself on keeping things as they were. To Carl, progress was just a word people used when they wanted to mess things up. And as far as he was concerned, the Rivera family was progress personified. They didn't belong here. He folded his arms across his chest, glaring as Matilda turned and waved across the street. "Hey there, neighbor," she called, her voice carrying easily to Carl's lawn chair. Carl stiffened. He didn't wave back. Matilda's smile didn't falter. She turned back to her family, helping Jess maneuver a small coffee table into the house. Carl watched them like a hawk, his mind racing with irritation. What were they doing here? Who were these people to come in, make a scene, and act as though they belonged in his neighborhood? The front door of the yellow house swung open, and a pride flag billowed softly in the breeze. Carl's scowl deepened. "Oh, for Pete's sake," he muttered, shaking his head. The flag felt like a personal affront, a declaration of defiance that Carl couldn't ignore. He stood up abruptly, the lawn chair groaning as he pushed himself upright. "Martha?" he called toward the house. A woman's voice floated back from inside. "What is it now, Carl?" Carl grumbled something unintelligible as he stomped across the lawn and through the front door. His wife, Martha, was in the kitchen, washing dishes as sunlight streamed through the window. She turned to look at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and patience. She knew that look on his face well. "Did you see them?" Carl demanded, gesturing wildly toward the window. "The new neighbors?" Martha frowned slightly. "You mean the Rivera family?" "Yes, Carl, I saw them." "What about it?" Carl's mouth opened and closed, his frustration bubbling over. "What about it?" "Martha, they've got flags up already. They're loud, they're different, it's just not right." Martha dried her hands on a dish towel, giving Carl a long, measured look. "Not right according to who, Carl?" Carl sputtered, caught off guard by the question. "Well, everyone. People like that don't move into neighborhoods like this. It's not what Maplewood Heights is about." Martha sighed, her expression softening. "Carl, times are changing. You can't expect everything to stay the same forever. Maybe you should go over and say hello." "Say hello?" Carl's face turned red. "I'll do no such thing. I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with this nonsense." Martha shook her head, turning back to the dishes. "Suit yourself," she said calmly. "But they're not going anywhere. You might as well get used to it." Carl muttered something under his breath, storming back toward the front door. He stepped onto the porch and glared across the street, where the Rivera family was now setting up patio furniture. The younger couple had a speaker playing soft music, and Matilda was directing the group with the confidence of someone who owned the world. Carl's fists clenched. By the following morning, Carl's mood had soured even further. The Riveras had been up late, laughing and talking as they set up their new home. Carl had gone to bed muttering about noise pollution and disrespectful people, only to wake up to see Matilda mowing her lawn at 8 a.m. It wasn't just the family's presence that bothered him. It was their joy, their laughter, the way they carried themselves with pride, completely unapologetic for who they were. Carl couldn't stand it. He sat on his porch, gripping his coffee mug tightly as the younger couple across the street began setting up decorations. Streamers, balloons, a folding table. Carl frowned, watching as a sign was propped up in the grass. "Welcome home party, everyone's invited." "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Carl muttered, his blood pressure rising. He slammed the coffee mug down on the railing, glaring across the street. The nerve of these people. They hadn't even been here 2 days and they were already throwing a party? Carl felt his face flush with anger as neighbors began trickling over. Friendly faces he'd known for years, now smiling and chatting with the Riveras like they were old friends. He couldn't take it anymore. Carl marched down the steps of his porch, his worn sneakers crunching against the gravel driveway as he stormed across the street. He ignored the curious glances of neighbors, his eyes locked on Matilda, who was standing near the folding table with a pitcher of lemonade in hand. "Excuse me," Carl barked, his voice sharp. Matilda turned, her smile bright and easy. "Well, hello again, neighbor," she said warmly. "I'm Matilda. Would you like some lemonade?" Carl ignored the outstretched pitcher, his hands planted firmly on his hips. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Matilda raised an eyebrow. "A party," she said simply. "We wanted to meet everyone and say hello. You're welcome to join us." Carl scoffed, his face twisting into a scowl. "This isn't that kind of neighborhood," he snapped. "We don't do this." Matilda's smile didn't falter. "What kind of neighborhood is that?" Carl hesitated, realizing too late that he'd walked into a trap. He sputtered, searching for words. "You know what I mean." Matilda's expression grew cooler, though her voice remained calm. "I'm afraid I don't, Carl." Carl's face reddened further, his frustration bubbling over. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but people like you don't belong here." "You're... excuse me?" Jess had appeared beside Matilda, her kind expression replaced by a sharp edge. The neighbors who had gathered nearby fell silent, their eyes darting between Carl and the Riveras. The tension in the air was palpable. Carl opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Matilda stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Carl," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I think it's time we had a little talk." Carl's chest heaved, his hands trembling as Matilda's words lingered in the air. A little talk? What could that possibly mean? He felt the weight of curious eyes pressing on him from all sides. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was replaced by a prickly silence that seemed louder than any noise. Matilda's expression remained calm, but her eyes held a challenge Carl wasn't sure he was ready for. Jess stood beside her, one arm resting on her hip, watching Carl with a mixture of frustration and disappointment. Behind them, the younger couple had stopped what they were doing to observe the scene, their playful smiles now replaced with looks of concern. Carl swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I don't need to talk," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." Matilda's brow furrowed, and her lips curved downward in a frown. "Oh?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly is everyone else thinking, Carl?" Carl's face turned redder, and his mind scrambled for an answer. He hadn't expected to be confronted, especially not like this, out in the open. He glanced around, hoping to find some backup, but the other neighbors were silent. A few shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze, while others simply watched with quiet interest. Matilda didn't let him off the hook. "Come on, Carl," she said, her voice steady but unyielding. "You stormed over here like you had something important to say. So say it." Carl sputtered. This isn't the kind of place where we have." He waved his hand vaguely toward the pride flag fluttering above their front porch. "This." Matilda's gaze didn't waver. "This?" Carl's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You know what I mean," he snapped. "People like you don't belong here. You don't fit." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Carl heard someone let out a sharp gasp, but he kept his eyes on Matilda. She stood still for a moment, studying him with an expression Carl couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, though he knew she had every right to be furious. It wasn't pity either. It was something stronger, something more resolute. Finally, Matilda took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as though releasing the tension from her body. "You know, Carl," she said quietly, "I've heard a lot of things in my life, but I never get used to hearing someone tell me I don't belong." Jess stepped closer, her voice soft but pointed. "Belonging isn't about who you are, Carl," she said. "It's about what you bring to the community." Carl opened his mouth to argue, but Matilda held up a hand, silencing him. "Carl," she said firmly, "before you dig yourself into an even deeper hole, let me tell you something about my family." Carl blinked, surprised by her tone. "I don't need to hear your life story," he grumbled, though his voice faltered slightly. "Oh, but I think you do," Matilda replied, her voice steady and calm. "Because you clearly don't know us, or anything about why we're here." The crowd leaned in slightly, the tension in the air crackling like electricity. Carl shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes, but Matilda's gaze held him in place. She crossed her arms, her posture relaxed but commanding. "My wife and I have worked hard our entire lives," she began. "We've raised children, built careers, and fought for every inch of respect we've earned. When we found this neighborhood, we saw a place full of potential, a place where people could come together, grow, and thrive." Jess nodded, stepping in beside her. "We didn't come here to cause trouble, Carl. We came here to build something. To create a home." Carl let out a scoff, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. "Doesn't mean you have to shove it in everyone's faces," he muttered, glancing pointedly at the pride flag still fluttering above their house. Matilda's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. "That flag," she said, gesturing toward it. "That flag isn't about shoving anything in anyone's face. It's about pride. It's about visibility. It's about saying, we exist and we're not ashamed of who we are." Jess's voice softened. "It's not meant to offend anyone, Carl. It's just part of who we are." Carl shifted uncomfortably, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. He didn't like being lectured, especially not in front of his neighbors. "I don't care what it's about," he snapped. "It's still not right." Matilda's expression darkened slightly, but before she could respond, one of the younger men stepped forward. It was the redhead with the ponytail, his face calm but his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You know what's not right, Carl," he said. "Judging people you don't even know." Carl turned to glare at him. "I don't need to know you to see what's going on here." The man's lips quirked into a small smile, though there was no humor in it. "Really? Because I'm pretty sure you've already made up your mind about us without even saying hello." Carl bristled. "I don't need to say hello to know when something doesn't belong." The redhead shook his head, his expression one of disappointment. "That's the problem, Carl. You're so afraid of change that you'd rather cling to your ignorance than see what's right in front of you." The crowd murmured again, a few nodding in agreement. Carl's face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. He felt cornered like a dog with nowhere to run. "This isn't about change," he snapped. "It's about respect." Matilda raised an eyebrow. "Respect?" she repeated. "You want to talk about respect, Carl? You came onto our lawn and accused us of not belonging here. You've been watching us like we're criminals, spreading your judgment like it's the gospel. You don't know a thing about us, and yet here you are, lecturing us about respect." Carl opened his mouth to argue, but Matilda wasn't done. "You want to talk about what belongs here? Fine. Let me tell you something, Carl. My family owns this house. And the one next to it. And the one 2 doors down." Carl froze, his mind stuttering to a halt. "What?" Matilda's expression was unyielding. "You heard me," she said calmly. "We didn't just move in, Carl. We invested here. We bought these homes, renovated them, and made this neighborhood better for everyone. So if you want to talk about belonging, let me make one thing clear. We own this block." The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, stunned, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. You own?" "Yes," Jess said, her voice firm but calm. "We own the block, Carl. And we're not going anywhere." The crowd erupted into whispers, neighbors exchanging surprised glances. Carl's face turned an even deeper shade of red as the truth sank in. He'd spent 2 days stewing in anger, convinced the Riveras didn't belong, only to find out they were the most invested family on the block. Matilda stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "So tell me, Carl," she said softly, "who exactly doesn't belong here?" Carl had no answer. The weight of her words settled over him, pressing down on his chest like a boulder. He looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to back him up, but the crowd had grown quiet. The neighbors who had gathered were watching him now, their expressions a mix of disappointment and disbelief. For the first time in years, Carl felt small. He turned his gaze back to Matilda, his voice faltering. I didn't know. Matilda's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. Maybe next time, you should try asking questions before you make assumptions? Carl nodded stiffly, unable to meet her gaze. He turned and walked back toward his house, the quiet murmurs of the neighbors following him like shadows. His steps felt heavy, his mind spinning. How had he been so wrong? As he reached his porch, Carl glanced back one last time. The Riveras were still there, standing tall, their pride flag fluttering brightly in the breeze. And for the first time, Carl didn't feel anger when he looked at it. He felt ashamed. Carl sat in his worn-out recliner, staring blankly at the muted TV screen in his living room. The soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead did little to distract him from the knot of tension twisting in his chest. Outside his window, the Riveras' welcome home party continued, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint sound of music that drifted across the quiet neighborhood. He couldn't bring himself to look out there again, not after what had happened. The memory of Matilda's words echoed in his head like a hammer striking an anvil. "We own this block." The phrase rattled him, not just because of its weight but because it had shattered everything he thought he understood. The Riveras weren't some outsiders who didn't belong. They were invested, established, and respected in ways he hadn't even considered. And now, as he sat alone in his darkened living room, Carl couldn't shake the image of the neighbors staring at him with disappointment in their eyes. For the first time in his life, Carl felt like he was the one who didn't belong. "Dinner's ready," Martha's voice broke the silence, her tone flat but pointed. Carl glanced toward the kitchen, where Martha stood holding 2 plates of food. Her expression made it clear she had a lot to say, and none of it was going to be pleasant. He sighed, pushing himself up from the recliner and shuffling to the dining table. Martha set the plates down and sat across from him, her gaze steady. Carl avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the roast chicken and mashed potatoes in front of him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally Martha spoke. "So," she said, her voice even. "Do you want to tell me what that was all about?" Carl's shoulders slumped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb, Carl." Martha's voice hardened. "You made a fool of yourself out there today and I want to know why." Carl bristled, his grip tightening around his fork. "I didn't make a fool of myself. I was just trying to." "To what?" Martha interrupted sharply. "Make them feel unwelcome? Push them out? Because from where I was standing, all you did was embarrass yourself in front of half the neighborhood." Carl looked up at her, his face reddening. "They don't belong here, Martha," he said weakly, though even he didn't sound convinced. Martha set her fork down with a sharp clink. "And why is that, Carl? Because they're different? Because they don't fit your outdated idea of what this neighborhood should look like?" Carl opened his mouth to argue, but Martha held up a hand to stop him. "No. You listen to me for once," she said firmly. "Those people, our new neighbors, are some of the most decent, hardworking folks I've seen in a long time. They didn't deserve the way you treated them today, and you know it." Carl's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Martha leaned forward, her voice softening slightly. "You know what I saw today, Carl? I saw a family moving into a neighborhood they were excited to call home. I saw them laughing, smiling, and inviting people to get to know them. And I saw you, the man I've been married to for 35 years, storming over there like some grumpy old bully. You embarrassed yourself, Carl. And worse, you embarrassed me." Carl flinched at the sharpness in her words. He couldn't remember the last time Martha had spoken to him like that. She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Carl. You used to be better than this." Carl set his fork down, his appetite gone. He looked down at his plate, guilt simmering in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice trailing off. Martha arched an eyebrow. "Didn't mean to what? To insult them? To make them feel unwelcome in their own home? Because that's exactly what you did, Carl." Carl's throat tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to say that he wasn't a bad person, that he'd just been caught off guard by the Riveras' presence. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. What he had done was wrong. There was no way around it. Martha pushed her chair back and stood up, gathering her plate. "You've got a choice to make, Carl," she said quietly. "You can keep sitting here, wallowing in your ignorance, or you can go over there and try to make it right." Carl looked up at her, his face pale. "Make it right?" he echoed. "You want me to go over there and apologize?" Martha's gaze was steady. "That's exactly what I want." Carl shook his head, his pride flaring up again. "I'm not doing that. They'll laugh in my face. Maybe they will, Martha replied calmly. Or maybe they'll prove to you that they're better than the man you've been acting like. With that, she turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving Carl alone at the table. He stared at the empty chair across from him, Martha's words ringing in his ears. You embarrassed yourself. And worse, you embarrassed me. Carl let out a shaky breath, rubbing a hand over his face. The next morning, Carl woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at his worn slippers as the morning sun streamed through the blinds. The events of the previous day played over and over in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. He had been wrong. He knew that now. But the thought of facing the Riveras, of apologizing, made his stomach twist with dread. How could he possibly go over there after the things he'd said? A soft knock on the door broke through his thoughts. Martha poked her head into the room, her expression softer than it had been the night before. I'm going to the store, she said quietly. You want anything? Carl shook his head. No. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the room. Think about what I said, Carl, she said gently. It's not too late to make this right. Carl nodded, though he didn't say anything. Martha gave him one last look before turning and leaving the room, the sound of the front door closing softly behind her. Carl sat there for a long time, his thoughts swirling. He thought about Matilda's calm, steady voice. He thought about Jess's disappointment. He thought about the neighbors watching him with judgment in their eyes. Finally, he stood up, letting out a long sigh. He didn't know if he could fix this, but he knew he had to try. An hour later, Carl stood on the sidewalk across the street, staring at the Rivera's house. The pride flag still hung from the front porch, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. A few cars were parked in the driveway, but the house was otherwise quiet. Carl hesitated, his palms damp and his heart pounding. He felt like a kid again, like he was about to get scolded by the principal for something he knew he shouldn't have done. Taking a deep breath, he walked slowly across the street. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he forced himself to keep moving. By the time he reached the front door, his chest felt tight and his throat was dry. He raised a trembling hand and knocked twice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open and Matilda stood there, her dark hair pulled back and her expression unreadable. She looked at Carl with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, though she didn't say anything. Carl swallowed hard, his voice catching in his throat. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I wanted to talk to you. Matilda crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. About what? Carl took a shaky breath, forcing himself to look her in the eye. About yesterday, he said quietly. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things. I shouldn't have treated you and your family like that. Matilda's expression softened slightly, though she didn't respond right away. Carl shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. I don't know why I acted the way I did. But I'm sorry. Matilda studied him for a moment, as though deciding whether or not to believe him. Finally she nodded. Thank you, she said simply. Carl blinked, caught off guard by her calm acceptance. That's it? Matilda smiled faintly. What did you expect? A lecture? Carl let out a weak chuckle, rubbing his neck again. Maybe. Matilda stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Why don't you come inside, Carl? She said. There's still coffee left from this morning. Maybe we can start over. Carl hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that, he said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, Carl felt like he was finally taking a step in the right direction. Carl hesitated for a beat, his feet heavy as though they'd grown roots into the Rivera family's porch. The idea of stepping inside their home, the home of people he had dismissed, insulted, felt strange, even wrong. But Matilda's steady gaze told him the invitation was genuine. There was no smugness in her voice, no attempt to rub his embarrassment back in his face. It was an offer. A chance. Coffee sounds good, Carl said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. Matilda nodded once, satisfied, and stepped aside to let him in. The moment he crossed the threshold, Carl was struck by the warmth of the Rivera home. It wasn't just the inviting scent of coffee and the faint sweetness of baked goods wafting from the kitchen. It was something more, something intangible. The house felt alive. Bright colors filled the space, from the vibrant throw pillows on the couch to the cheerful artwork hanging on the walls. Family photos lined the mantel, pictures of Matilda and Jess laughing together, of vacations with the younger couple Carl had seen at the party, and of a teenage girl grinning ear to ear, a soccer ball tucked under her arm. You have a daughter? Carl blurted out before he could stop himself. Matilda looked over her shoulder as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. We do. Her name's Ellie. She's at soccer practice right now. She'll be back later. Carl blinked, caught off guard. He didn't know why the thought surprised him. Maybe because it didn't fit the narrow image he'd had of this family in his head. She play for the school? He asked, trying to sound conversational. She does, Jess replied as she entered the room, carrying a plate of fresh muffins. Her smile was kind, but Carl could still see a guarded edge in her eyes. Captain of the team, actually. She's a natural. Carl nodded awkwardly, feeling out of place in the cozy, welcoming home. That's great, he mumbled, taking the mug of coffee Matilda handed him. He wrapped his fingers around the ceramic like it was a lifeline, the heat grounding him. Have a seat, Matilda said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Carl hesitated for a moment before finally lowering himself into one of the chairs. He glanced at Jess, who sat across from him, then at Matilda, who stood with her back to the counter, her arms crossed loosely. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clink of Jess setting the plate of muffins down. Carl cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Look, I'm not good at this, he admitted. Apologizing, I mean. Matilda arched an eyebrow. We noticed. Jess bit back a small smile, her eyes twinkling with amusement, but she said nothing. Carl let out a long sigh, staring down into his coffee. I've been in this neighborhood a long time, he said slowly. 35 years. I've seen things change, but I guess I always held on to the way things used to be. He looked up at Matilda, his gaze hesitant. I thought I was protecting something good. But maybe I was just holding it back. Matilda's expression softened slightly, though she didn't let him off the hook that easily. And you thought we were the problem? Carl winced. I thought you were different. And I don't like different. He paused, shaking his head. Or at least, I didn't. Jess leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Different doesn't mean bad, Carl, she said. It just means different. Carl nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. I see that now. Yesterday, I got caught up in my own nonsense. And I'm sorry for the things I said. I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't welcome here. Matilda studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she pushed off the counter, walking over to the table and sitting down beside Jess. You know what I don't get, Carl? She asked, her voice steady but calm. Why does it bother you so much? The flag. The family. What are you afraid of? Carl frowned, staring into his coffee again. He didn't know how to answer that. He'd spent so many years letting himself believe that people like the Riveras didn't belong, that their lives, their love, their joy somehow threatened his own. But sitting here now in their home, he couldn't find a reason to hold on to that belief anymore. I guess I thought, he faltered, searching for the words. I thought you moving here meant I was losing something. Like the world was changing too fast for me to keep up with it. Matilda's voice was soft but unrelenting. And what did you lose, Carl? Really? Carl opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What had he lost? Nothing. The Riveras hadn't taken anything from him. They hadn't hurt him or his family. They had simply existed, and for some reason that had been enough to make him angry. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Maybe I didn't lose anything. Maybe I just convinced myself I had. Jess smiled faintly, reaching for one of the muffins. Change can be scary, Carl, she said, breaking the tension slightly. We get it. But change isn't always a bad thing. Carl looked up at her, surprised by the kindness in her voice. You're awfully nice to me considering how I acted yesterday, he said gruffly. Jess shrugged, her smile warm. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after. Matilda nodded, her gaze still steady. You coming over here was a good first step, Carl. It takes guts to admit you were wrong. Carl's face reddened slightly, but he nodded. I don't want to be that guy. The one everyone in the neighborhood talks about, the guy who couldn't accept good people just because they were different. You don't have to be, Matilda said simply. You can do better. And we'll give you the chance to prove it. Carl blinked, caught off guard. You will? Jess nodded. We're not here to make enemies, Carl. We're here to make a home. If you want to be part of that, you're welcome to. Carl's chest felt tight, but this time it wasn't with anger or frustration. It was relief. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice rough. Matilda smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. Just don't let it happen again, she said, though her tone was light. Carl chuckled, a genuine sound that surprised even him. I won't, he promised. For the first time, the tension eased. Jess passed Carl a muffin, and he took it gratefully, the simple act feeling like a peace offering. They sat there for a while, talking quietly, About the neighborhood, about Ellie's soccer team, about the Rivera's plans for the future. Carl listened more than he spoke, taking it all in. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down with strangers, people he'd been so sure he disliked, and felt so comfortable. When he finally stood to leave, Matilda walked him to the door. "Thanks for the coffee," Carl said awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Anytime," Matilda replied with a smile. "And Carl?" He paused, turning back to her. "It's not too late to be a good neighbor," she said softly. Carl nodded, his throat tight. "I'll remember that." As he stepped outside, the sun was warm on his face. The pride flag still fluttered on the porch, but this time it didn't bother him. It was just a flag. Nothing more, nothing less. For the first time in a long time, Carl felt like he could breathe. Carl shuffled back across the street toward his house, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the morning's conversation. The air outside was quiet now, the remnants of the Rivera family's welcome party finally cleared away. The neighbors who had gathered yesterday were gone, back to their routines, but Carl could still feel their eyes on him, even if they weren't there. As he climbed the steps to his porch, Carl paused for a moment and glanced back at the Rivera's house. The pride flag still fluttered in the breeze, vibrant and unashamed. Something about it looked different to Carl now, less like a challenge and more like a declaration of joy. "Not too late to be a good neighbor," he muttered under his breath, Matilda's words still echoing in his mind. When Carl stepped into the house, he found Martha in the living room, folding laundry while a faint hum of music played from the radio. She didn't look up as he entered, but Carl could tell from the set of her shoulders that she'd been waiting for him to come home. "Well?" Martha asked, her voice calm but expectant. Carl sighed, lowering himself into his recliner with a groan. "I talked to them." Martha paused mid-fold, finally looking up. And Carl hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. "And I apologized." Martha's eyes softened, though her lips twitched faintly in surprise. "You did?" Carl nodded, feeling awkward under her gaze. "Yeah, I told them I was wrong. That I shouldn't have said the things I said or treated them the way I did." Martha blinked, her expression softening further, though there was still a glimmer of surprise in her eyes. "And how did they take it?" Carl leaned back in his recliner, staring up at the ceiling as though the answers might be written there. "Better than I expected," he admitted. "Matilda said it took guts to admit I was wrong. Jess said they'd give me a chance to prove I can do better." Martha nodded, her hands stilling for a moment over the laundry. "That sounds fair." Carl let out a long sigh, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, I guess it does." He hesitated before adding, "They're good people, Martha. Better than I gave them credit for." Martha's lips twitched into a small smile. "Took you long enough to figure that out?" Carl shot her a look, though there was no heat behind it. Yeah. Rub it in." She shook her head, her smile softening into something warmer. "I'm not rubbing it in, Carl. I'm proud of you. I know admitting you were wrong isn't easy for you." Carl grunted, looking away as his face flushed faintly. He didn't like the way those words, "I'm proud of you," made his chest feel tight, like he didn't quite deserve them yet. He thought back to the Rivera's house, to the photos on the mantel and the quiet grace in Matilda's voice. They had given him something he hadn't expected, a chance. And he wasn't about to waste it. Martha seemed to sense his discomfort and let the subject drop, turning back to the laundry. For a few moments, the room was filled with nothing but the quiet rustle of clothes and the faint hum of the radio. Carl closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair, and let himself breathe. Later that afternoon, Carl found himself standing in his driveway, squinting at the sun as he watched a few of his neighbors go about their day. Across the street, the Rivera family was outside again, this time planting flowers along the edge of their front lawn. Matilda knelt in the dirt with a trowel in hand, chatting with Jess, who stood nearby holding a tray of small potted plants. Carl watched them for a moment, an unfamiliar feeling twisting in his chest. It wasn't anger or resentment this time, it was something closer to regret. For years he had been proud of his reputation as the neighborhood watchdog, the man who kept everything in order. But now, for the first time, he wondered how many good people he'd pushed away with his narrow-mindedness. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts, and Carl turned to see his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, walking toward him. Henderson was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Carl had known him for decades. They were cut from the same cloth, or so Carl had always thought. "Afternoon, Carl," Henderson grunted, coming to a stop beside him. "Afternoon," Carl replied, crossing his arms. Henderson nodded toward the Riveras, his scowl deepening. "You believe this? Throwing parties, planting flowers, Acting like they own the place? Carl stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening. They're just trying to settle in, he said after a moment. Henderson snorted. Settle in? Please. People like that don't settle anywhere, they take over. First it's flags, then it's loud music, then it's who knows what else. Carl frowned, glancing back toward the Rivera's house. He saw Jess laughing as she brushed dirt from Matilda's cheek, the two of them sharing a moment of quiet joy. There was nothing threatening about them, nothing that warranted the bitterness in Henderson's tone. They're good people, Carl said quietly, surprising even himself. Henderson turned to look at him, his face twisting in disbelief. Good people? You're kidding, right? You're the one who marched over there yesterday. Now you're defending them? Carl shifted uncomfortably, the heat of Henderson's judgment heavy on his shoulders. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice gruff. I shouldn't have treated them the way I did. Henderson stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You've gone soft, he scoffed, finally shaking his head. I can't believe this. First they move in and now you're over here playing nice? Carl felt a flicker of irritation, but it wasn't aimed at Henderson, it was at himself. He had been just like this yesterday. Just as bitter, just as stubborn. He had been so sure of his righteousness that he couldn't see how wrong he was. And now, listening to Henderson, he realized how small and ugly it sounded. I'm not playing nice, Carl said firmly. I'm trying to do better. Henderson snorted again, his expression filled with disdain. Suit yourself, Carl. But don't come crying to me when they ruin this neighborhood. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Carl standing alone in the driveway. Carl watched him go, a strange mix of frustration and pity swirling in his chest. He could see now what he hadn't seen before. Henderson was afraid, just like Carl had been. But Carl wasn't afraid anymore. He turned back toward the Rivera's house, his gaze lingering on the flowers they were planting. A splash of yellow and purple bloomed against the green lawn, cheerful and bright. It was such a small thing, flowers, but it made the house look warmer, more inviting. Carl found himself smiling faintly. Looks nice, he called before he could stop himself. Matilda looked up, shading her eyes with her hand. When she spotted Carl, a smile spread across her face. Thanks, Carl, she said warmly. You should come see it up close when we're done. Carl hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe I will. Matilda gave him a small wave before turning back to her work. Carl stood there for another moment, watching as Jess handed her another plant, the two of them chatting quietly as they worked side by side. Carl's smile lingered as he turned and walked back into his house. The next morning, Carl stood in his kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee when he noticed something strange outside the window. Across the street, the Rivera's pride flag was gone. In its place, the pole hung empty, the fabric missing entirely. Carl frowned, his stomach sinking. He set his coffee down and stepped out onto the porch, squinting toward their house. Matilda and Jess were outside, their brows furrowed as they inspected the empty pole. Matilda's shoulders were tense, her mouth set in a tight line. Carl's gut twisted. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He knew. Without thinking, he walked down the steps and across the street. Matilda looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her face. Morning, Carl, she said, though her tone was strained. What happened? Carl asked gruffly, nodding toward the empty pole. Jess sighed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Someone took the flag, she said quietly. We found the pole like this when we came outside. Carl's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Who would do something like that? He muttered, though he already had his suspicions. Matilda shook her head. I don't know, she said, her voice calm but edged with frustration. But it's just a flag. We can replace it. It's not just a flag, Carl said, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. It's yours. Matilda blinked, her eyes widening slightly. Jess looked at Carl with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, as though seeing him for the first time. Carl turned, scanning the street as though expecting to see the culprit lurking nearby. He didn't, of course. The street was empty, quiet, normal. But Carl knew what had happened. Someone had taken that flag as a message, a cowardly, hateful message that made Carl's blood boil. Do you need help putting up a new one? Carl asked after a moment, his voice gruff. Matilda smiled faintly, though her eyes were still wary. That's kind of you, Carl, but we've got it covered. Carl nodded, though he still felt a tightness in his chest. Let me know if you need anything, he said. Anything at all. Jess looked at him for a long moment before finally smiling. We will, Carl. Thanks. Carl turned and walked back toward his house, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do next, though the thought of it made his stomach churn. For too long, he had been part of the problem in this neighborhood, part of the ignorance and small-mindedness that had allowed things like this to happen. But not anymore. Carl walked across the street, the flag tucked carefully under his arm. He could see Matilda and Jess out front again, still working on their flower beds. They looked up as he approached, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity. Matilda wiped her hands on her jeans and stood, shading her eyes against the sun as Carl reached the edge of their lawn. "Morning, Carl," she said carefully, her voice measured. Carl swallowed hard, the flag feeling heavier with every step he took. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the colorful bundle in his hands before glancing back up at them. I think this belongs to you," he said quietly, holding the flag out. Jess stood and stepped closer, her gaze soft but wary. She took the flag gently from his hands, her fingers brushing against the fabric as though it were something fragile and precious. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. Carl hesitated. "Someone left it on my porch this morning," he admitted. "I don't know who took it in the first place, but I thought it should come back to you." Matilda watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Carl replied, his voice firm. "It shouldn't have been taken in the first place." Jess smiled faintly, running her fingers over the flag before folding it carefully in her arms. "Thank you, Carl," she said quietly. Carl shifted awkwardly, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. He wasn't used to this, doing the right thing when no one had asked him to. It felt strange, but it also felt good, like a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. I don't know who did it," Carl said after a moment. "But it wasn't right. And I wanted you to know that." Matilda nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "We appreciate it, Carl." "Really?" Carl glanced at the flower beds, where the bright yellow and purple blooms were already starting to take shape. "The flowers look nice," he said gruffly, changing the subject. "Thanks," Matilda replied with a smile. "We thought they'd brighten up the place." Carl nodded, rocking back on his heels. "Well, I should probably get going." "Carl," Jess said, stopping him as he turned to leave. He looked back at her, surprised. She smiled warmly. "We're having a barbecue this weekend, just a little get-together with some of the neighbors. You're welcome to come by." Carl blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Yes, you," Matilda said with a chuckle. "You've earned it." Carl hesitated, his instinct telling him to politely decline. But something in the way they looked at him, calm, open and welcoming, made him pause. He nodded slowly, his voice soft. "I'll think about it." Matilda smiled. "We'd like to have you there." Carl gave a small wave before turning and heading back across the street. As he walked up his driveway, he couldn't help but feel a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The next few days passed quietly, but Carl couldn't shake the feeling that things were different now. He noticed the way neighbors looked at him when they passed on the street, some with surprise, others with quiet approval. Word about the incident with the Rivera's flag had spread, as gossip in Maplewood Heights always did, but this time, Carl wasn't the villain in the story. That Saturday, Carl stood at his window, watching as cars began to line up along the Rivera's curb. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air, carried on a soft breeze, and he could hear the faint sound of music playing from their backyard. Neighbors were already gathering, people Carl had known for years, now chatting and laughing with the Riveras like they'd been friends forever. Carl shifted awkwardly in his living room, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had told Matilda he would think about it, but now, standing here alone, the thought of going over there made his stomach twist with nerves. "They invited you, you know," Martha's voice startled him, and Carl turned to see her standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "I know," Carl grumbled, avoiding her gaze. "And you're just going to stand here and stare at them from your window?" Carl shot her a look. "I don't know if I'm ready for that yet." Martha raised an eyebrow, walking over to him and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Carl Jenkins, I've known you long enough to know when you're scared. And right now, you're scared of going over there and realizing they're not the problem. You are." Carl frowned, his chest tightening. "I already know that," he admitted quietly. "Then do something about it," Martha said simply. Carl looked at her for a long moment before sighing and grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. "Fine," he muttered. "But I'm not staying long." Martha smiled, handing him a container of her famous potato salad. "Take this with you. It'll help break the ice." Carl snorted but took the container, tucking it under his arm as he stepped outside. The sound of the party grew louder as he walked across the street, his steps slow and deliberate. By the time he reached the Rivera's backyard, Carl could feel sweat gathering under the brim of his hat. The yard was lively, filled with laughter and conversation. Children ran across the grass, playing tag while adults stood in clusters, chatting over plates of food. A grill sizzled nearby, the smell of burgers and hot dogs filling the air. Carl spotted Matilda and Jess near the grill, laughing as they flipped burgers and handed out drinks. Matilda spotted Carl first. Her face lit up with a smile and she waved him over. "Carl," she called. "You made it." Carl forced a small smile, holding up the potato salad as he approached. "Martha made this," he said gruffly. "Figured I'd bring something." Matilda took the container with a grin. "Tell Martha she's a saint," she said. "We'll put this out right away." Jess appeared beside her, holding a cold drink in one hand and a plate in the other. "Welcome, Carl," she said warmly. "It's good to see you." Carl shifted awkwardly, glancing around at the crowd. "Looks like you've got a good turnout," he said. "We do," Matilda replied, her smile easy. "It's a good group of people." Carl nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he scanned the yard. He spotted neighbors he'd known for years, some who had stood on his side of the street not too long ago, now chatting happily with people they might have once ignored. It was strange, but it also felt right. "You hungry?" Jess asked, holding out a plate. "We've got burgers, hot dogs, and some veggie options too." Carl hesitated for a moment before finally taking the plate. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." Matilda and Jess shared a smile before turning back to the grill. Carl wandered over to the food table, filling his plate with a burger, some salad, and, of course, a scoop of Martha's potato salad. He found an empty chair at one of the picnic tables and sat down, feeling the eyes of a few neighbors on him. To his surprise, no one looked at him with judgment or suspicion. Instead, a few people nodded or smiled as they passed, offering quiet greetings. "Hey, Carl," one man said as he walked by. "Glad to see you here." Carl looked up, surprised. "Yeah, thanks." As he sat there, eating his food and listening to the hum of laughter and conversation around him, Carl felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own neighborhood. He felt like he belonged. Carl sat at the picnic table for what felt like hours, watching the party unfold around him. Laughter echoed from every corner of the Rivera family's yard, mixing with the sizzle of the grill and the clinking of glasses. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their squeals of joy punctuating the warm afternoon air. It was the kind of gathering Carl had seen 100 times in this neighborhood, except it wasn't. It was different because he felt different. Matilda and Jess moved easily through the crowd, chatting with neighbors and making sure everyone felt welcome. The energy in the yard was warm and inclusive, alive in a way Carl couldn't remember feeling for years. He spotted families he'd known for decades standing side by side with people he'd dismissed not too long ago, laughing and swapping stories like they were old friends. For the first time, Carl realized how much he had missed out on, how many opportunities for connection he had let pass him by because of his own fear and pride. He looked down at his empty plate, a small lump forming in his throat. "Need a refill, Carl?" Carl glanced up to see Jess standing there, a smile on her face and a fresh glass of lemonade in her hand. "Yeah," Carl said gruffly, handing her his empty plate. "Thanks." Jess took it and handed him the drink. "You doing okay over here?" Carl nodded, though his voice was quieter when he spoke. "Yeah. Just taking it all in, I guess." Jess smiled knowingly. "It's nice, isn't it? Being part of something." Carl looked up at her, surprised by how much truth there was in her words. He didn't respond right away, but when he finally did, his voice was soft. "Yeah, it is." Jess patted his shoulder gently before walking back toward the grill, leaving Carl alone with his thoughts. He sipped his lemonade slowly, watching as neighbors he once considered allies now chatted happily with Matilda, as though the past few days had never happened. Carl wasn't sure what to make of it, how easily everyone seemed to embrace the change that had once terrified him. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Matilda walked over and sat across from Carl, a plate of food in her hands. "Mind if I join you?" Carl shook his head. "Not at all." She smiled and dug into her plate, eating quietly for a moment before glancing up at him. "You doing okay?" Carl let out a soft chuckle. "Funny. Jess asked me the same thing." "She's a good judge of people," Matilda replied with a grin. "It's her superpower." Carl nodded, swirling his lemonade in the glass. "I didn't think I'd come," he admitted after a moment. "Didn't think I'd feel welcome here." Matilda raised an eyebrow. And now? Carl sighed, glancing around the yard. Now I'm glad I did. Matilda's smile softened and she leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. You know, Carl, when we moved here, we knew there'd be people who didn't want us here, people who saw us as a problem. That's nothing new for us. Carl looked down at his hands, shame prickling at the back of his neck. I was one of them, he said quietly. Maybe, Matilda replied gently. But you're here now. And that counts for something. Carl looked up at her, surprised by her words. How can you be so forgiving? Matilda shrugged, her expression calm. Because holding on to anger doesn't get you anywhere. Believe me, I've tried it. But forgiveness? That's how you move forward. Carl let her words settle over him, a small lump forming in his throat. I don't deserve it, he admitted. Matilda smiled faintly. Maybe not. But that's not the point, is it? Carl frowned slightly, confused. Then what is? The point is that you're trying, Matilda said. You're showing up. You're taking responsibility. That's more than most people ever do. Carl stared at her for a moment, his chest tightening with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe. Relief. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I'll keep trying, he said finally. I don't know how much good it'll do, but I'll keep trying. Matilda smiled, her eyes warm. That's all we're asking for. As the party began to wind down, Carl found himself lingering longer than he expected. He stood near the grill, chatting awkwardly with a couple of neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. They didn't treat him like an outcast or a pariah. Instead, they welcomed him back like nothing had changed. Good to see you here, Carl, one man said, clapping him on the shoulder. About time you came around. Carl nodded, his voice rough. Yeah, guess I'm a slow learner. The man laughed and handed Carl another drink. Better late than never, right? Carl smiled faintly. Right? He turned and looked across the yard, where Matilda and Jess were packing up the last of the food. The pride flag was back up on their porch, fluttering in the cool evening breeze, and this time, it didn't make Carl's chest tighten with anger. Instead, it felt right, like it belonged there. As the last of the neighbors began to leave, Carl walked back across the street toward his house. Martha was waiting for him on the porch, her arms crossed and a knowing smile on her face. Well, she asked as he climbed the steps. How was it? Carl paused, glancing back at the Rivera's house one last time. The lights were still on, casting a warm glow across the lawn. He thought about the conversations he'd had, the laughter he'd heard, and the way Matilda and Jess had welcomed him into their home without hesitation. It was good, Carl said quietly. Real good. Martha smiled, stepping aside to let him into the house. Told you it wasn't too late? Carl chuckled softly, shaking his head. You were right. As usual. Martha followed him inside, her smile widening. Get used to saying that? Carl grunted, but there was no bitterness in his voice, just quiet acceptance. He sat down in his recliner, kicking off his shoes as he leaned back with a sigh. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel so empty. As he sat there, his mind drifted back to Matilda's words. Forgiveness is how you move forward. Carl didn't know if he would ever fully forgive himself for the things he'd said and done, but he knew he could try. He could show up. He could be better. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next morning, Carl stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Across the street, Matilda stepped outside to pick up the morning paper. She looked up and spotted Carl, a smile spreading across her face. Morning, Carl, she called. Carl raised his coffee cup in a wave, his lips curling into a small smile. Morning, Matilda. As she turned to head back inside, Carl's gaze drifted to the pride flag fluttering gently in the breeze. It was just a flag, just fabric stitched together, but to Carl it meant something more now. It meant progress. It meant change. It meant hope. And for the first time in his life, Carl welcomed it.